The Research and Evidence Facility is supported by the European Union Emergency Trust Fund and has been created to collate and produce evidence and policy relevant knowledge. My name is Padmini Iyer, and I am the Advocacy and Outreach Manager for the REF. Today's webinar will explore refugee livelihoods and economic inclusion in Kenya, and the opportunities and obstacles for private sector engagement in Kenya's refugee hosting areas. The REF commissioned a study in 2020-2021 to understand the steps refugees must take to find employment and entrepreneurship in Kenya, as well as the steps a private sector firm or company must take to employ a refugee or support refugee entrepreneurship. This was done in order to identify concrete opportunities for private sector engagement, as well as the steps to address blockages in facilitating refugee workers' employment. The study was conducted by the Botho Emerging Markets Group, an advisory firm that redefines and redirects Africa's position among emerging markets through investment facilitation, strategy consulting, policy advisory services, and research. The findings of the study will be presented by Bathsheba Asati and Liviya David. Bathsheba is a research associate at Botho and has experience in research and policy in the extractives industry. She has previously worked in the Office of the Chief Justice of Kenya and at Extractives Brazza. Liviya is a business development and research analyst at Botho and has experience in fundraising and business development for social enterprises, NGOs, and for-profit businesses across a range of sectors in East Africa. Liviya previously worked at Educate and was a Princeton Africa Fellow at Helpage International. Today, we have the pleasure of having three discussants who will also provide their reflections on the study, as well as other thoughts around private sector engagement in the refugee hosting areas of Kenya. Our first discussant will be Luba Shara, who is a senior operations officer at International Finance Corporation based in Nairobi. She is the co-author of the IFC consumer market study, Kakuma as a Marketplace, which examines Kakuma camp and town through the lens of a private firm looking to enter a new market. Luba is also project manager for the Kakuma Kalobeyei Challenge Fund, IFC's largest advisory engagement and the first IFC refugee-related engagement in sub-Saharan Africa. We will also hear from Elizabeth Mukami, who is the Economic Recovery and Development Coordinator for the International Rescue Committee in Kenya. And finally, we will hear from Reza Fazel, who is a principal at Open Capital with experience designing interventions in sectors such as energy access, agriculture, and healthcare, particularly for hard-to-reach last-mile populations. As co-lead of Open Capital's humanitarian practice, Reza has experience in private sector engagement and partnerships in displaced populations. And most recently, he has led teams to design scalable pilots and market-driven blueprints to develop sustainable livelihoods across priority value chains for urban and rural refugee communities in East Africa. So we will start with Botho Emerging Markets Group's Liviya and Sheba presenting the results of the study, followed by short interventions by our discussants. You are welcome to put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand in the Q&A session, which will follow. We would like to remind you that the views expressed in the webinar are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the Research and Evidence Facility or the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. And as you have seen, the webinar is being recorded. So I'll hand it on to Liviya to present the findings of the study. Thanks.
Thanks, Padmini. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon for most of us here. It's really great to be here together today, although virtually. My name is Liviya David, and I work with Botho Emerging Markets Group. I'm joined by my colleague, Bathsheba Asati, and today we will be presenting the findings of the upcoming REF report on refugee employment and entrepreneurship in Kenya and opportunities for private sector engagement with refugees in the country. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a brief lay of the land of what Sheba and I will be talking about today. We'll start off by briefly discussing our overarching research question, our motivations for conducting the study, and the methodology we employed. We'll then go into a brief overview of the current state of refugee policy at the national, regional, and international levels. Next, we'll outline the current state of play of private sector involvement with refugees in Kenya. We'll then talk about our key findings before finally ending with our recommendations. And without further ado, Sheba, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Liviya. Our work at Botho has shown us that the private sector is critical to achieving refugee economic inclusion. And as the humanitarian space is shrinking, there is a growing need for more sustainable and durable solutions to support refugees as well as their host communities. To successfully implement these durable solutions, the private sector needs to be engaged in facilitating greater access to economic opportunities for refugees by one, integrating them into formal labor markets and also into national and regional supply and value chains. We also see opportunities for the private sector to play a larger role in supporting refugee-owned businesses, either through investment or even by providing business training and mentorship support. As we move into this new era of private sector engagement in humanitarian issues, it's important to interrogate what that looks like and what we need to do to unlock the full potential of the private sector engagement with refugees. This study therefore examines the obstacles and opportunities that exist for the private sector in Kenya to successfully engage with refugees, either as employers or as catalysts for entrepreneurship. Before we present our findings, I'd like to point out that as Padmini mentioned, we conducted the study between June 2020 and April 2021. And because of the pandemic, we were unable to travel to refugee camps and therefore had a smaller sample size than we had initially anticipated. So our presentation doesn't intend to generalize about the current state of affairs when it comes to private sector engagement in refugee issues. Instead, we hope to share detailed insights into the experiences of different stakeholders regarding refugee entrepreneurship and employment in Kenya. As Liviya mentioned, we'll start off by discussing the current context in Kenya when it comes to refugee economic inclusion, focusing on the policy environment, and then focusing on the policy environment and then private sector engagement. Policy is a critical factor that determines the lives and experiences of refugees in their host countries and in any third country where they may be resettled. In many countries, Kenya included, there exists a disconnect between what the government's commitments under international and regional frameworks and what refugee policies state on paper at a national level, and even how these policies are applied in practice. For example, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework and the 2019 Kampala Declaration both advocate for granting refugees access to jobs and education, as well as augmenting their freedom of movement. In practice, Kenya's encampment policy, which was enacted in 2014, remains in force even after Kenya signed both the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework and the Kampala Declaration. Freedom of movement, as we'll discuss further in the presentation, is very important to refugees for several reasons. One of them being applying for different documents that they may need, such as a work permit, sourcing inventory for their businesses, and even building connections with private sector partners.
Our study confirmed that there is private sector involvement with the refugee cause in Kenya currently, which is exciting. And we did a high-level mapping that revealed that these 5 key actors on the left are the ones mainly involved, which includes the likes of Equity Bank in the large Kenyan company category and the African Entrepreneur Collective in the regional companies category. But, and importantly, our study also confirmed that the potential for the scope of engagement, which includes both the type of engagement and firms that can be and are engaged, is not yet realized. Engagement from the private sector can go beyond CSR programs or direct employment of refugees alone. It can include things like mentorship and business support to refugee and host community-owned businesses, time-bound assistance in specific business functions, think legal, finance, operations, including refugee or host community-owned businesses in supplier value chains, and using platforms and advocacy power to advocate for refugee integration and greater access for refugee rights to movement and work. Further, although there are a few firms in each of the categories that you see on the left, there is a massive missing layer of firms whose engagement can be cultivated further. We found 5 key reasons for why engagement is currently limited. 3 of those are at a systems level. ambiguity and uncertainties in the policy and legal environment, particularly around refugee movement, employment, documentation, and the right to stay in Kenya legally, increases perceptions of risk for private sector companies who may be seeking to engage with the refugee cause. Second, and because of those legal and policy uncertainties, many actors in the private sector feel as though they lack information on how to engage refugees and work in refugee hosting areas practically. Then third, even if companies can move past the policy uncertainties and manage to fill the information gaps, poor infrastructural conditions, particularly in terms of roads, consistent energy supply, and water, make it expensive or unrealistic for companies to set up shop in Kenya's main refugee hosting areas. One of our interviewees noted that companies need to have both enough available cash and enough risk appetite to move into refugee hosting areas in the country because of how expensive it is to work in Kakuma and Dadaab because of supply chain issues. These three systems level barriers that I mentioned go on to affect market level realities, particularly around private sector businesses trying to sell products in refugee settings. In our research, we found few examples of the private sector engaging with refugees as direct customers. And this is for two reasons. First, free goods and services ultimately distort the market. And second, low incomes mean that even if refugees may want to buy products from the private sector, many may not be able to afford to. Of note, only one of our private sector interviewees engaged with refugees as customers, and that was based on the organizational mission of working with refugee entrepreneurs.
We see that there's the scope for the private sector to be more involved, and there's also willingness on their part, but that can only go so far because refugees themselves face very many challenges and constraints when it comes to pursuing economic opportunities. At a baseline, documentation is very difficult for refugees to access. So once displaced people arrive in Kenya, they face long, unpredictable, multi-step processes before their refugee status is confirmed and an ID and a refugee ID is issued. And even when refugee status is confirmed, it may take years for refugees to obtain the necessary documentation to fully access the services that they need to be able to participate in society. For example, a refugee ID is needed to access financial services and to also apply for other documents such as the Class M work permit, which is the permit that refugees need to access formal employment in Kenya. And just to give you an example of this delays, one of the refugees that you spoke to has been in Kenya since 2016. And they've tried to apply for this refugee ID a number of times, but they still haven't received it. The Class M work permit is another document that's very important for refugees, especially those who are seeking to work in the formal sector. However, from our interviews, we confirmed that there are constraints at two levels. The first is in obtaining the documents that are required to apply for the permit, and the second is in issuance of the permit itself. And none of the refugees that we spoke to knew of someone who had successfully applied for the Class M work permit, even after providing all the requisite documents in the application. The challenges when it comes to documentation are not just limited to the difficulties in the process. There are also multiple information gaps on the side of refugees, and a number of the refugees that you spoke to mentioned that they lacked sufficient information on one, the documents that are available to them under Kenyan law, and two, the documentation process itself. Even with the requisite documentation, the opportunities that refugees can access in Kenya are limited because of the encampment policy. And as you mentioned earlier, movement is a cross-cutting issue when it comes to access to economic opportunities for refugees. And it's very integral to connecting refugees with potential employers, business partners, or in even accessing economic opportunities outside the camps. And currently, movement permits are granted on an ad hoc basis, and which makes it very difficult for refugees to plan their travel in and out of the camps. And because of all these limitations around movement, refugee entrepreneurs specifically rely on host community members to support them in replenishing their stock or purchasing items from nearby cities, which in turn increases the business expenses. Finally, even when you solve for the issues around documentation and movement, it's equally important to also look at the quality of opportunities that refugees have access to. One of the issues that was raised by our refugee interviewees was that was around equal wages, where many of them were pointing out that they're paid significantly less than their Kenyan counterparts for the same amount of work. You can't just look at refugees in isolation, and I think that's one of the things that you need to remember in this conversation. You also have to look at the context within which refugees exist and the communities that host them. Specifically looking at the relationship between host community members and refugees themselves. And one of the things that this study revealed is that the relationship between these two communities is multidimensional, with many positive aspects that can inform future programming into refugee hosting areas. For instance, both refugees and host community business owners employ individuals from the other community to be able to attract certain customer segments from each other's communities. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, refugees rely on host community members to bypass some of the existing movement and documentation barriers. One interesting example that we found was of an urban refugee who revealed that her Kenyan friends had helped her register a company on her behalf, since she wasn't able to register the business herself as a refugee. And this support from her host community members has allowed her to operate a formal business in Kenya. And although there are very many positive aspects to the relationship between host community members and refugees, tension still exists between these two communities. And this tension mainly arises from perceived unequal access to economic opportunities. It's therefore important that as we're talking about refugee economic inclusion or developing solutions to bridge some of these gaps, to include solutions that also benefit host community members to promote social cohesion and mitigate any tensions or marginalization.
So at this point, we've walked you through our key findings about refugees' experiences in accessing economic opportunities and the importance of engaging the host community. And now I'd like for us to talk about what's happening at the systemic level that's needed or missing for deeper private sector engagement with refugee economic issues in Kenya. First, private sector actors we interviewed for this study were willing, eager, and interested to engage with refugees, which shows that this initial barrier of awareness we've already moved past it. But these private sector actors felt that they lacked information on how to engage refugees both practically and legally. For example, one of our private sector interviewees mentioned that they were not even sure if their company could legally employ refugees, nor were they sure how to compensate refugees, and were generally not clear on the processes they needed to go through to do so. Largely, our private sector interviewees also felt that they lacked information on what skill sets and technical capabilities refugees could offer their businesses. Second, private sector actors felt that once these information gaps were filled, there needed to be an enabling environment and incentives, ideally from the government, to encourage greater private sector engagement with refugees. What could those incentives look like in practice? Some interviewees proposed financial incentives, saying that the government could institute a quota for companies to employ a minimum number of refugees and subsequently receive tax incentives for meeting that quota. Others proposed non-financial incentives, but rather ones that were about information, such as a one-stop shop database where private sector actors could see refugees' different skill sets and understand how refugee employees could add value to their businesses. Lastly, and cutting across my two earlier points, one of the things we realized in the course of our interviews is that there was a general consensus that, yes, the private sector should be involved. Yes, we can't achieve refugee self-reliance without the private sector. But at the same time, interviewees mentioned that there was no clear stakeholder group that was pushing this agenda of private sector engagement forward. Between actors, there's some degree of fragmentation of who's doing what, there's some degree of a lack of coordination, and there's some degree of siloing between all of the different groups who work on refugee economic issues. So while a whole of society approach is needed, yes, private sector actors in particular that we interviewed felt as though no one actor was moving this agenda forward in a way that moved beyond disciplinary or sectoral silos. So to recap what we've talked about so far together, we set context around the current national, regional, and international refugee policy environment. We outlined the current state of play of private sector actors' engagement among refugee issues in Kenya. Then we transitioned into discussing the experiences of refugees in accessing economic opportunities, the importance of engaging the host community, and the systemic barriers that currently exist to greater private sector involvement with refugee issues in Kenya. Now we move into our recommendation section on ways forward for different actors. That takes me to our study's first recommendation. Any intervention to catalyze greater private sector engagement with the refugee cause in Kenya, and really anywhere, it's not just limited to one country, will have to be underpinned by a multi-stakeholder platform that allows donors, government, the private sector, camp implementation partners, UNHCR to meet, host convenings, co-create programming, and learn how to speak the other's language, so to speak. This will ideally solve for the fragmentation and lack of clear ownership of private sector engagement in refugee issues. In practice, this platform is the Amahoro Coalition, an initiative by Botho that is already working to get private sector actors more involved in humanitarian and refugee economic issues through action-oriented resources and targeted advice for businesses on how to leverage their models for impact in displacement-affected settings. Donor governments like the EU can invest in and fund these kinds of multi-stakeholder platforms like the Amahoro Coalition, which particularly speaks to the EU's strategic goals in the Horn of Africa, including supporting refugees' long-term development needs. With the multi-stakeholder platform in place to create strategy around private sector engagement, private sector actors can have a basis to start to engage. And engagement can happen through a few different means. First, targeted assistance for programming in refugee hosting areas, both through mentorship and business support for refugee and host community-owned businesses, and through time-bound expertise in specific business functions. Endeavor and Venture for Africa are two organizations that have existing models for short-term fellowships at African organizations who need specific strategic expertise. And private sector actors in Kenya would be wise to learn from these kinds of organizations and prototype their own models for similar work. Simultaneously, the multi-stakeholder platform can work to fill the information gaps that we discussed earlier that are acting as major barriers for greater private sector engagement. And this can happen through awareness raising sessions by various private sector interest groups in Kenya, such as the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, as well as information sessions hosted at the multi-stakeholder platform to demystify processes around refugee employment and entrepreneurship for both potential employers and investors. Third, as Shaba mentioned earlier, restrictions on movement, unpredictable movement authorization processes, and unreliable and vague work permit and documentation requirements are significant barriers in refugee economic inclusion and self-reliance. It is therefore important that all stakeholders involved advocate for refugee self-reliance through greater freedom of movement and easier documentation processes. While addressing these issues is ultimately the responsibility of government, it should also be at the forefront of advocacy priorities for donors, private sector actors, and civil society organizations. For the private sector, working with refugees could ultimately serve as a new market entry point because having employees from the refugee community can build trust between businesses and different refugee communities. And in the long term, should refugees return to their country of origin, they can act as agents, franchise owners, or partners to support market entry and business setup for Kenyan businesses looking to expand. And then finally, one other area important to address is around local economic development. Refugee hosting counties in Kenya, that's mainly Turkana and Garissa, are in the early stages of private sector investment, despite being vibrant markets in their own right. Local economic development must accompany initiatives for promoting external private sector investment in refugee areas. Donors, both government and institutional, should explore supporting facilities that provide technical and financial support to small and medium enterprises in Kenya's main refugee hosting areas. One example is through creating facilities that can serve as business incubators that can target multiple stages of businesses, offering more directed support for newer businesses to ensure that younger entities aren't left behind. This facility is an interesting solution and conceptualization, as it can also serve as a potential opportunity for engagement between local private sector businesses in Turkana and Garissa and external private sector firms from outside those counties to engage through business training or mentorship. Ultimately, local economic development will not only enable local businesses to generate greater revenues and thus provide more employment, it will also develop the local private sector to a point of attracting external investors and business partners. And with that recommendation brings us to the end of our presentation. I'd really like to thank you all for your time and attention, and we'll pause here as we transition to hearing from the panelists.
Thank you so much, Sheba and Liviya, for keeping the time and walking us through the findings of the study. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Luba Shara from the International Finance Corporation to share her thoughts with us. Luba, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and I hope you can hear me, correct?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Luba Shara. I'm the project manager for Kakuma Kalobeyei Challenge Fund. We started in Kakuma back in 2016 with a research called Kakuma as a Marketplace. And what we tried to do at that time, we tried to figure out how exactly what your research produced, how we can engage ourselves, because IFC is a development investment bank. So we invest in the medium-sized and larger businesses across the globe, and how we can enhance the business environment in Turkana. So we concentrated and we focused on Kakuma refugee camps. So a lot of findings from your study is very familiar for me. So I was not surprised when I saw the recommendation and the key findings. What's important is that more and more research is being produced. So everyone who's new to the area or new to the refugee space will learn or find more examples of meaningful private sector engagement. So a lot of your recommendations, what's in the research and in the presentation, we're already doing with Kakuma Kalobeyei Challenge Fund. So let me just mention a couple of them. So first of all, for example, promoting an enabling environment for private sector investment. It's very true when you start working in Kakuma and you ask 5 people about how to employ refugees, you probably will get 10, 15 different answers. So the idea, what we decided to do, we decided to join forces with the European Union, UNHCR, and Turkana County government to launch one-stop shop business center in Kakuma. In Kenyan environment, it's called Bashara Huduma Center. And the idea is to produce a place where Turkana people, but also refugees would come and get services they need. So we did a very detailed research about who needs what, and we identified different groups, because different target groups, for example, host community, they need one set of services, and then refugees will need something else, and entrepreneurs from both sides need something else. So we plan to open, we found the building, we are refurbishing the building, we're developing all the procedures, and we plan to open the one-stop shop in Kakuma in August of next year. So the idea is that instead of trying to ask people or to figure out on your own how to get that permit or this permit, the person will simply go to the one-stop shop and get services. And just to give you an example how important it is, you cannot register birth in Kakuma town now. So the local people have to travel to Lodwar, which is kind of the main city of Turkana County, and it's about 120 kilometers away. So many people don't even register the birth of their kids and wait till they are of school age, and then they show up at school and no one knows where those kids came from. So it's very acute problem. So one recommendation, I don't know why you focused only on refugees. For me, it's never only about refugees. It's about host community and refugees. So I would, if you will try to enhance the study or continue doing research further, I would recommend to kind of emphasize that it's not only about refugees, it's about integration or partial integration between host community and refugees. So that's one thing we are already doing, and hopefully we will launch the center next year. Also facilitate local economic development. There are many efforts, and we are trying as Kakuma Kalobeyei Challenge Fund coordinate with various partners on development side, for example, GIZ and Swiss Contact and European Union, to see who is doing what in terms of I cannot pronounce it, sorry, making Kakuma a municipality. And in this case, it would be important to understand where private sector can play a role in this. I was surprised that you didn't do anything on water and land, because for private sector, those two issues are the paramount. So for me, 5 issues private firms are asking, and we are not working. You mentioned, I think it was your slide 2, you mentioned that KKCF is working with SMEs. We are also working with the larger companies. And 5 questions everyone is asking how to get there, because there is very little information, even in Nairobi, about how to get there. Humanitarian actors know, but not the private sector. Second is exactly what you've said, and emphasize how to employ refugees. Can I employ refugees? Is it even legal? So it's super that you emphasize and put it up in your research. It's a very acute and #1 issue. Then the third one is how to get land. The fourth is how to get water, and the fifth is how to get electricity. So we have been working with 5-6 larger firms. One is agricultural production. So they are asking about infrastructure. If they want to put whatever they are producing in the truck and move to the rest of Kenya, to other parts of Kenya, how exactly to do it. They're asking how to access land. Land is communal in Turkana, and it's not an easy issue at all. It's actually quite complex. How to get the land plot and what permits should be. It's not straightforward at all. And you cannot do it, arguably, in my humble opinion, without the involvement and really close cooperation with relevant ministries in Lodwar from Turkana County government. So again, if I emphasize, if you continue to do your research, it would be important to focus also on land, water, and infrastructure. I'm not sure about strategy. I don't think that's how private sector works, actually. We don't need any strategy. We need, what is happening that private sector involvement in refugee space, and specifically in camp and in Horn of Africa, where we have 100 camps and settlements, we don't have positive precedents. We don't have examples. If my goal as a project manager for Kakuma Kalobeyei Challenge Fund is to create positive examples of real commercial companies engaging in refugee space, hiring refugees, paying them salaries, and then we can advertise and do a lot of knowledge management events and show, look, we manage it in Kakuma, we can do it in Nakivale, we can do it in West Nile, we can do it in Rwanda, we can do it in Ethiopia. So of course, with customization. At this point, we don't have positive examples. We don't. so private sector might be involved from corporate social responsibility angle, but not on commercial basis. At least I don't have any good examples about the real commercial companies. So that's what we need. I don't think that starting from strategy, let's develop a strategy, and then I think it should be vice versa. You know, no one, when people founded Netflix, they didn't start from strategy. The same for Google, the same for Facebook. They're just were guys in the garage. So the same for us. We are trying to create small precedents, small positive examples, and then based on our struggle and our successes and failures and our lessons learned, we can then say, look, this is what works, this is what doesn't work. And then probably there will be some strategy, but I wouldn't put it in the first place. So what else? Yeah, addressing gaps in information, it's super important. And that's how we started. So we started approaching our own investment clients here in Kenya and explain where Kakuma is, how many hours to fly there, which airlines fly there, where to sleep there, what to do. So we are, the information is not there. So for me, that's also together with the permit M and the question how to employ refugees, it's one of the most acute gaps. The larger companies or companies based here in Nairobi, they don't know much or anything about how to start, where to start, what should be the entry points, and how to meaningfully engage. So let me give you an example. We're talking to a pharmacy chain in Nairobi to find the first modern pharmacy in Kakuma town. So in addition, so what we are helping is we are trying to find even the location where they can put the pharmacy, even the actual location. Then they're asking Luba how to connect to water and how to connect to electricity is not a problem. They will have a generator, but how to get land and how to get access to water. So very straightforward business questions. So that's what we are engaged in. So advocate, yeah. So we are. What you're doing is really great. So the only thing I would say that I would put the target kind of audience, advocate to whom and with whom, because you know, if we talk only to ourselves, that's great, but we really need to talk to the national government of Kenya about the economic opportunities in those areas. And again, for me, it's super important to say host community first of all, and refugees, and together. And then if we will coordinate, which we already do, and do more advocacy efforts and investment promotion, specifically in Turkana, I think in a couple of years, we might see meaningful results. So let me stop here. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Luba. Thank you for those very important points, and I'm sure that we'll come back to it in the discussion. I'd like to move on to Elizabeth for her thoughts on the study and on private sector engagement in refugee settings in Kenya. So thanks again to Luba, and over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Padmini. My name is Elizabeth Mukami, working with the International Rescue Committee as the Economic Recovery and Development Coordinator based in Nairobi, and supporting the urban programming for refugees and local vulnerables, and also having some work in Lodwar. So in regards to this research, actually, I resonate a lot with a lot of information that and the findings in the research. And basically, maybe first of all, just to tell you what IRC does within the urban setup, we have a livelihood program that focuses on supporting both refugees and locals mainly from the informal settlements of Nairobi. We have been doing this work since 2017, in as much as we had some earlier work done in regards to livelihood, but robust livelihood work has been since 2017 till now. So when I look at the kind of work we do, we focus on a number of areas. We focus on skills building to be able to match the demand that is there in the market. We also focus on supporting the refugees and vulnerable locals be able to get into gainful employment, mainly with working with private sector, partnering with private sector. And so straight into like when I look at the findings from this research, when I look at the issue of, let's say, getting opportunities within the private sector, that has been a major challenge, and I'm glad it comes out very clearly in this research. And you find that like for IRC, yes, we have partnered with a number of private sector and we get some employment. But the major challenge being it is only internship and apprenticeship. So now the challenge remains getting then these refugees into long-term employment. This has been the main challenge. And I'm glad when I see that there is a lack of adequate information, even from private sector actors, on how to engage refugees, because this has been the major challenge. And we have had a number of forums with the Refugee Affairs Secretariat and a number of private sector trying to address this issue, because the refugees may have the right skills to be engaged, and the private sector has the willingness to engage. But the challenge is they are like, what protects me as an employer? Because they need to know what documentation is required. How is this refugee going to remit taxes, you know, pay as you earn? And yet the employer will be held liable if they do not abide by all this. So the lack of adequate information, I find it very crucial, and there's need, as per the recommendation, that there's need to collaborate, to have information, proper information shared, and getting to advocate for the issue of right to work is there on paper, but in reality, implementation is very difficult, because then you find they do not, like for all the time we have been working with refugees within the urban space, there is no single work permit that has been attained. Reason being, it takes too long, as per the findings have shown here. It takes too long to get this documentation. There are a lot of stumbling blocks that make it difficult then for refugees to be able to attain employment. I am speaking mainly on refugees because I know, yes, there is vulnerability among the host communities, but then the stumbling blocks for refugees then become even more, because yes, the issue of, let's say, for example, if there are work opportunities and we work with private sector, it becomes easy for an employer to say, okay, give me the locals that are there and I'll absorb them. But for refugees, hold on a bit. I need to know, what documentation will I use? Will I use the alien card? Will I use, what kind of documentation will I use? What documentation will protect me as an employer? And so that has been one of the major challenges working with private sector. So you find that in most cases, they just get short-term opportunities that are not leading to self-reliance. So currently, what are we doing? We are seeking for opportunities within the private sector still and advocating more. We are looking for more partnerships with, like, for example, the Nairobi County government, city county government, to try and see how can we then address these stumbling blocks. How can we get to the Ministry of Interior and say, refugees are here and they are here with us and we can't ignore that fact? How can we then support them to get into gainful employment, or facilitate policies that are able to support these refugees to be able to live an independent life and move towards self-reliance without necessarily depending on aid? Because as long as we keep branding them as refugees and looking at them as a separate population, then it becomes a challenge for them to be absorbed into the local economies. it becomes a challenge for them to be integrated into the communities and be able to transact, to participate in the local economies like the locals. We are currently looking at, as I said, opportunities working with the national government also. So a number of ways to advocate for this, to be able to address these challenges that have been brought out here. Actually, when I looked at it, I said, it just spoke to me. This is exactly what we are talking about. These are the challenges, but they should not end on paper. Let this push this research to a level now of influencers, the actors who can push this to be addressed so that refugees' voices can be heard into this. I do not know whether, or probably I missed it out. Like, I know there was limitation of the issue of COVID that maybe provided a challenge in terms of reaching a much larger population, but there's need to engage like the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, KEPSA, and the Federation of Kenya Employers and put down some strategies on how do we work with these influencers and the actors who are able to influence these kind of findings and are able to bring something to the table and say, okay, we are at least addressing this and addressing this and addressing that. So I look at that as one of the ways we can actually use this research to influence the kind of work that we are doing, the different agencies. And then the issue of, I know like Equity is doing a good job in regards to access to financial services, but then how can we involve central bank, for example? Because the regulators are the ones who also are key in influencing this. How can central bank, like let's say, for example, a refugee is able to produce a document, an acceptable document that will enable them to register, for example, SIM cards. They are able to transact on mobile money transfers. They are able to access financial services. They are participating. They are doing a lot within the local economies, but we need to have this word on, data that is backing that. To say that, look here, if we incorporated refugees in our employment, in our local economies, then this is the kind of contribution they are able to make in regards to even our economy, So not seeing them as a burden, but seeing them as a resource and as an asset within which even the citizens participate in this space. I do not want to take so much of the time, but I'll just wind up and say we are also doing some work in regards to value chains, and this will also push into the private sector. How we would want to be to involve in even refugees to participate in some of the value chains. We have started with the textile and clothing. We know there is the agenda within the national agenda to even revive some of the industries like the clothing and textiles, like what we had before, and we have seen the president wearing these shirts. So how can refugees participate in this? Like, I'll give you an example. The Congolese are very good with these, we call them kitenge, the African fabric that is used to make these attires. So how can that come on board and really make value to our economy? How can we involve them so that they are not looked at as refugees, but people who also contribute to the economy, and they are able to gain self-reliance through that? So I really appreciate the work that has gone into this. I know there are a number of things that you can still input to make it richer, so that then this document can be used, these findings can be used then to speak to the influencers, to the actors and the rest who are speaking about the refugee agenda. Thank you very much. Back to you, Padmini.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thanks for your thoughts and yeah, really critical issues. I don't want to pause here, but I'd like to move on to Reza, and then we'll come back to a question and answer and discussion round. I'd like to give the floor to you, Reza, and also to the audience. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand when we start the Q&A after Reza's intervention. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Padmini. My name is Reza Fazel. I'm a principal at Open Capital, where I also co-lead our humanitarian efforts across the region, really focused at speaking to our experience on private sector growth and partnerships. I think it's great to have this discussion today, and thanks so much as well There's certainly a lot of buzz around this space, and I think it's these sorts of discussions that can hopefully catalyze more and much needed action now as well. I think a lot of excellent inputs already by Luba and Elizabeth. So I'll try and add from perhaps a slightly different angle. And it's those last points actually that Elizabeth shared that excites me the most. So maybe I'll try and elaborate on some of those. Speaking to our experience as well in this space. I think it was really great to see this research and a lot of interesting, and as Luba said, perhaps not so many surprising findings, but helpful to have it all together and think about what comes next as we think about private sector engagement. And what we found over the last few years working in the space across the region, that while encouraging employment and entrepreneurship or self-employment is great and much needed, we also need to think about how we move beyond silos. And arguably to really achieve meaningful, lasting, sustainable economic impact, we need to do more by talking about holistic value chain integration for refugee and host community businesses, and really think about it from market systems development perspective. And I think to do that, we also need to zoom out a little bit and paint a more holistic picture, so then we can come back in to allow ourselves to create that paradigm shift that we want to achieve. As a sector, as a community, when we talk about private sector and refugee and host community engagements. I think there's many things that we already know, but just as a recall at a meta level, when we think about the refugee experience or the host community experience even, it is changing. What I mean by that is an increasingly urban experience. More and more refugees are going urban. It's 60% today and growing. It's also an increasingly long-term experience. Refugees are more likely in their place for 20 plus years rather than 2 years. I think it's something like only 2 or 3% of refugees go home every year, if not less. And it's also a very youthful experience, right? With half of refugees under 18. So with stuff that we already know, with the backdrop of COVID, what it points to is a picture where solutions need to be multidimensional and market-driven and integrated to really stand a chance of offering that longer-term sustainable livelihood development for refugees and host communities, which we're striving for. I think everybody on the table, agrees generally that private sector engagement and partnerships is needed. Incentives exist on all sides of the table, on the humanitarian side as well as the economic side. But it's about now, how do we think about displaced people as not just refugees or even host community, but how are they employees and employers? How are they consumers and suppliers? How are they businesses and political leaders? And how do we view refugees as contributors to the economy? They may have lost, their home, but they haven't lost their business acumen, for instance. And I think one of the things that was great to see as well in the research is private sector engagement already exists, right? Host community and refugee-owned businesses, MSMEs, they're already there. There is lots of transactions. There are those growth economies. But how do we support them? And arguably, it's about thinking about where do we bring in more established private sector businesses to integrate these refugee and host community MSMEs beyond employment, beyond encouraging self-employment and entrepreneurship, but thinking about how we integrate them into these formal value chains as suppliers, as input providers. How do we help them to link to markets? I think that's where we can begin to start creating a much more organic, attractive commercial incentive for private sector. As Luba was saying, private sector doesn't need strategy. If there's an incentive, private sector will be there. And I think it's that sort of play which really creates a interesting and unique opportunity for development partners as well. And it's that sort of longer term gain through these more holistic market systems approach, as opposed to perhaps siloed interventions applied across multiple sectors, and which may result in near-term gains. But I think it's also important that we now start thinking beyond that and thinking about how we integrate this to add real economic value. How do we think about where does the supply exist and how do we link the demand? It's not just about a business employing refugees, but we're actually thinking about it in the grand scheme of things to make sure that we're linking all these pieces together. I wanted to keep it fairly brief, so I'll conclude there. I think just a few insights essentially from our experience at Open Capital, working in these challenging economic environments and trying to create value and impact. Of course, happy to discuss and share further with anyone that might be interested. Elizabeth talked at the end a little bit about the sort of example on textiles and value chains. I think that's an area that we're extremely excited about to work together with IRC, where we don't just think about refugee or host communities as how do we employ them or how do we help them to start these businesses in these opportunity areas, but how do we think from a value chain perspective, say for an EPZ, for instance, an exporter in textiles, to look at refugee-owned existing businesses, host community businesses in this value chain as potential suppliers, right? Where is it that they can become a much more viable economic contributor, so that we can build that longer-term gain and sustainability that we're all after. But yeah, I'll close there. And Padmini, back to you, and would love to sort of receive or hear any questions or comments around all of this. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Reza, and thank you again to Botho, Luba, Elizabeth, and Reza for their interventions. So I'd like to invite anyone who has any comments or questions. And as you are raising your hand, I'd like to ask our panelists, all of them, including Botho, to start off a question. So I think the research and also IFC's previous research that Luba, you mentioned around the similar topics, it seems to me like the kind of the take-home message obviously is around regulatory or legal or policy issues with refugee employment and private sector engagement. So obviously the advocacy needs to happen. And as you said, Luba, advocate to whom and for what? And those are some of the questions that need to be asked. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on whether such advocacy has been happening, as well as what the role of the private sector is in doing this kind of advocacy, and whether that's something that in your experience has happened, or how you see that role. Obviously from the civil society perspective or from civil society organizations, this is an advocacy that continually happens. But I'd like to open the floor to any of you who wants to take that question and present your thoughts. Thanks.
I can start. So for me, it's a question of sequencing. So Kenya is one of those countries where larger companies, first of all, it's a country with a very vibrant private sector, right? And traditionally, the private companies had a relationship with the government and influence on the government. So our approach from our program, it's not us NGOs or development organization who has to advocate of us foreigners, it's Kenyan companies that have to advocate, right? Now, coming back to sequencing, they cannot advocate what they are not convinced in. So there should be, again, coming back, there should be positive examples, precedents of successful businesses in Garissa of Turkana, where both host community and refugees are engaged and employed. And it might be on agri-side business, it might be small manufacturing, it might be honey production, we're looking in that direction, or anything else. And then if that business or that business model works, then arguably, together with us, those private businesses will say, look, dear government, that's how it works. It's profitable for us. It actually increases security in the border regions of the country because people are engaged, employed, and get real benefits, and their livelihood increase in very straightforward way by being employed. And then they will advocate. So that's how we see the sequences. So for us, from KKCF perspective, we're trying to push and engage as many companies, which is happening right now. So those companies in a year, and especially after One Stop Shop will open, will start advocating from their perspective, using their contacts, using their kind kind of connections in the government instead of me being a foreigner advocating for something. So, IFC general, that's my view. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Luba. Any of the other panelists, would you like to come in?
Yeah, Elizabeth here. I think I really agree with what the one who spoke before me has said, and one of the things I'm looking at, I'm asking myself, advocacy by who and for who? Because when we talk about advocacy, it has been happening. It is not just coordinated. Everybody is doing it in their small way. Everybody is doing it like, I'm advocating for this because I have received funding for this and I want to advocate for refugees. And then after the funding, the work dwindles and disappears. But there is need to have a collaborated advocacy. And this collaborated advocacy will be done jointly, not just by those who are just the ones pushing for it, but as I mentioned earlier, those who are also the decision makers. Whom are we advocating to? We are advocating to decision makers. Like when we hear a decision comes up and it's like by June 31st next year, all refugee camps must be closed. What helped inform that? What have we done in relation to that? What kind of advocacy are we picking to speak and say, wait a minute, as we say camps are being closed. They are being closed so that these refugees go where? We have refugees who have been born here. They have known here since like 1992 or more years. And you're telling somebody, I'm closing where has been. It's like coming to shut up your home and I'm telling you, go away. It is, I know the encampment policy is not the best, but there's need to advocate and advocate with reasonably those who are now like private sector providing employment, who are now able to advocate to a higher level and say, refugees are doing a tremendous job. We are hiring them. They are part of our workforce and look at the work they are doing. So we need to look into that. But again, when I look at that kind of advocacy, even with private sector, I'm asking myself, what is their main motivation as they do this? What will be the main motivation? Other than just, some of them are doing it as a corporate social responsibility. They are saying, okay, let's just do this as a corporate social responsibility. But apart from that, what else is motivating them? The motivating factor should be being able to see that they are able to meet their labor demands. They are able to address the gaps that exist in the market. So it is not just advocating, but also being able to ensure that even those we are advocating for are attaining the right skills, competitive skills that will address the labor market gap that exists. Then we are able to say, okay, combined with the private sector and the effort that we are putting together and a coordinated task force that is coordinating this and seeing that actually this is happening, then we are able to push up with one voice and say that this is actually happening. So advocacy is happening, to get back to your comment, Padmini, but there needs to be a more coordinated advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues from Botho, if you have any comments, otherwise, can I please turn to Danya? Sorry, yes, Danya Katan. Would you like to turn on your mic and present your comments? I think it'll be, they're good comments, so I'd like to invite you if you're okay with that. Danya, I don't know if you are hearing me, but if you are, I'd like to invite you to present your, okay, oh, never mind. Okay, so I'll just read it out. Thanks, Danya. So Danya has a few comments for the presentation. The importance of coordination of the assessment study, since we realize there's a lot of duplication. Yes. What is needed is something similar to the IFC study, which provides evidence on the contribution of refugees to the local economy, and this will help with the advocacy. And the challenges to engage private sector entails different aspects, infrastructure, information, and the added value of working in refugee contexts. And at the end, private sector will look for profit, And then finally, another challenge is the lack of job opportunities and the market saturation. Even if the government of Kenya is convinced it won't be easy to support refugees while Kenyans are still struggling to get jobs. I actually I would like to invite any commentary on that fourth point, particularly. It's something that I think we also touched upon a little bit in the report, the challenge of the job market in general. Any thoughts from colleagues from Botho, for instance? Did you come across this aspect in your research when you were doing the field study? Was this brought up as some of the concerns from the non-refugee participants?
I'll start, and then Liviya, maybe you can add anything that I missed. This actually didn't come up from many of the companies that you spoke to, because the greater challenge that we saw, and a lot of the questions were around, a lot of the questions that you got from these companies were around the information gaps that you've been discussing, where many of them don't understand what the refugee situation looks like exactly, the kinds of refugees, things like what are the skills of refugees, how can we tap into this market? I don't think that there are very many concerns about job opportunities or market saturation. I think that most of the concerns are around the legality of working with and employing refugees, or the legality of tapping into this workforce. And for us, we see these challenges, be it challenges around unemployment, or say access to education or access to economic opportunities, as an opportunity for the private sector to work together with some of these other organizations, be it government and donors, to co-create solutions around these issues, because they don't just face refugees, they also face host community members, they face native citizens, and solutions that are developed in the refugee context around, say, employment or access to other economic opportunities, be it entrepreneurship or even access to education, are solutions that can be applied in other contexts within these countries and would be beneficial to the citizens themselves.
Thank you so much. Liviya, would you like to add anything?
No, Shaba covered it.
Okay, fantastic. Any of the other panelists on this particular point of the market saturation and jobs? Because we, of course, talk about also the sort of social cohesion outcomes from private sector engagement for both, bringing together the integration of host communities and refugees, as a few of the speakers have spoken. But Luba, I would like to invite you if you have any comments on this particular point.
Yes, I have. And hi, Danya. I haven't seen you in a while, so welcome back. It is a big issue, and that's because, again, there are very few new ideas on the market. So the first thing people are thinking is a typical development approach is to offer training. So everyone comes and offer training, and then, okay, what you can offer training on. And in Kakuma, the camp exists since 1992. And since that time, and I'm exaggerating, but only to some extent, there were multiple training in 5 professions. And that Bora motorcycle operator or mechanic. And then it should be either welder, it should be hairdresser, it should be a social organizer, and it should be baker. 5. And then what organizations don't understand, that there's only so many hairdressers Kakuma can absorb, right? Even if you go to the hairdresser 5 times a day, you cannot have, let's say, 2,000 hairdressers in the camp. But new organizations come, and they come again, oh, people need training, and then train again. And of course, the level of diminishing, the point of diminishing return was achieved many years ago. The more people you train, the less job opportunities those people get. So what is missing in Kakuma is a larger private companies that come and they can absorb all those people who are trained since years ago, but still have no jobs. And when we interviewed, one lady told me, look, Luba, I participated in 3 trainings and I still don't have a job. And that's because the trainings ultimately are not related to employment. So I think we have to completely rethink it. So our idea for KKCF is from the opposite direction. We would like to bring employers and then organize customized training specifically for that employer. And we don't, as I've seen, we don't plan to do it. We will go, as I've said, we'll go to an International Rescue Committee, to GIZ, we will go to EU, we will go to Swiss Contact and ask them, guys, who's in a position to train 20 people in this and that position? And then people who graduate will actually have jobs, and that's what's important, because it's actually also create, we are all thinking about do no harm, but the harm is that we are coming to Kakuma with good intentions, and we train people honestly thinking that we're doing good, but we are doing not good. We're actually enhancing and increasing harm, because those people, that woman, instead of spending 6 months on training, which won't lead to employment, could spend that time with their kids, with her kids. So I'm just saying, because we also did the gender research. So for me, this connection between training and employment should be solid and established before any training is offered in Kakuma. Otherwise, it leads to more unemployment among people who were previously trained on the same profession, and also create quite a lot of resentments from the refugee side to international community. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just before moving to a question that's in the chat, I'd like to, I don't want to put you on the spot, Elizabeth, but are you comfortable commenting on this sort of skills building not matching up with the market thing, as from the civil society perspective? Just your thoughts on just what Luba has just mentioned, and how you see sort of skills building markets, and the 20 hairdressers in a 5-mile radius.
Yeah, and Luba is very right on that. But everybody is coming in and saying, skills, we want to build skills. Skills for what? There's need, first of all, to understand what is the gap that exists. I know even currently with the employers, and having engaged like Federation of Kenya Employers, and having met a number of employers also through this coordination, there is a gap that exists in the labor market. And the gap is, if I may just move away a bit from refugees and what we're addressing, and say, like, there are so many students in the universities, in colleges, and all of them are just training and coming up as graduates, and then they come they flood the market, and all of them are competing for same jobs. So those who are skilled, those who are unskilled, they are taking up every opportunity that exists in the market. So I understand even when Danya says the market is saturated. Now, the thing is, and from a point of what we are looking at it right now, not just training everybody, not just skills building, but approaching it from a demand-based approach other than supplier, in terms of approaching different employers, and we are like, what are some of the skills that you require? How many plumbers do you require maybe in the next 1 year? I know this is not something we have been doing aggressively, but we have a new project on board that we envision doing this very aggressively. Like, what do you need? So that we are able to train people skills that guarantee them a job in the market. And we have employers whom we can match directly these skills with, so that then the demand and the supply have a meeting point. We may not meet all of them, because again, we have those who already have some existing skills, but then refining and combining these with the on-the-job training also. I remember last year we approached Toyota Kenya, and we were like, we would want to know what kind of mechanics do you require, so that by the time you are training, they go to a school. You can recommend a school where they can go, and then they have some on-the-job training as they are undertaking this training, so that they don't train with ancient machines and they are coming to meet different types of machines that they are supposed to now work with the improved technology, and we expect that they'll be able to deliver. So looking at that, and so the issue is approaching this from a demand-based approach other than supplier, because then the supply will be flooded and the demand will continue to narrow. I would look at it from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Reza, would you like to comment on this point?
Yeah, just to comment briefly, I think Luba's example on sort of the hairdresser was probably put much more diplomatically than I could have. So I think, agreed with all those comments, and, also really appreciates Dania, your comments on the chat. I think those are spot on when we think about job creation, and I think your latest comment on support for MSMEs. And that's where I think there's a huge opportunity. If we're looking at the refugee-owned and host community-owned MSMEs, and if we're supporting them to get to the level where they can act as core value chain actors, suppliers, input providers for more anchor organizations and value chains, then automatically you're uplifting the employment within refugees, right? Because those refugee-owned businesses are going to then employ more refugees, and so helping at the business level is much more attractive. And I think, that's where, Dania, those comments are, I think, absolutely spot on in terms of it's a flooded job market. So how do we look at it from a much more market demand and supply sort of sequencing perspective as well?
While you're on the spotlight, Reza, you had mentioned that integrating MSMEs into established firms was one of the steps forward for private sector engagement. So can you briefly comment on what, according to you, are some of the barriers until now in this process happening, and what's something that you've seen?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll sort of try and talk to this maybe from an example as well. I think, when we think about the landscape of refugee and host community owned businesses, oftentimes they are relatively informal. They may not be the most sophisticated, but they do have some idea of filling a economic need and are, generating some revenue. So that's on one side. And then when you think about at that level, what are their barriers to scale? What do they need to then grow into markets? Because we talked about the textiles value chain earlier, I'll stick to that example. If we have a EPZ, and we have, they're sort of importing raw materials, they're manufacturing locally and then exporting out. How do we engage refugee and host community-owned businesses into that value chain in a much more sustainable and strategic way? And first, it's discussing with this EPZ, what are their key bottlenecks? What are they importing today where they can actually, would much prefer to supply locally? And it turns out that, things like buttons and zips and accessories for clothing is actually something that is very easy to manufacture locally, but for, quality reasons and others, they're not able to do that. How do you then work with a refugee and host community-owned MSME who's already in the textiles value chain, maybe working on some sort of, light manufacturing, but how do you then connect the two from that market demand and supply perspective to get them to the level where they can now produce at not just the volume that's needed for an EPZ, but also the quality that's needed? And then automatically, you now have a refugee-owned MSME that was informal yesterday, operating, yes, for many years, but you've taken them leaps and bounds by actually integrating them and landing them, effectively like perhaps a multi-year B2B contract. And just think then about the impact that creates on not just the business, but the employees and those families, and all refugee and host community, and all through, linking at that sort of anchor level of a value chain. The EPZ is coming in, and they're not doing it as a CSR initiative. They're doing it from a profit-making perspective, but it's filling a very clear and real need for them. And I think that's what makes it really compelling for all sides of the table.
Great, thank you. Actually, Sheba and Liviya, I'd like to pass on the mic to you, the virtual mic. If you want to comment on any of this, as well as there's a question in the chat Did the research look into diaspora as a private sector and its investment role to contribute or boost the local economy and propelling refugee self-reliance and possibilities of having such entities to join uplifting the life of refugees and hosts? So I'll pass on to you, Shara.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to your earlier question around the barriers that prevent the integration of MSMEs into some of the larger businesses. And I think from this research and from our work at Botho and at the Amahoro Coalition, we've seen three main ones. The first one being the information gaps and the opportunity and the level of business activity within refugee camps. And then the second one being around proximity, because in urban areas, you see more integration and reliance between and connections between native businesses and host and refugee businesses. But when it comes to the camps, because they're located very far away from some of these other businesses, you have that gap. And I think proximity is one of those issues that we need to think about and think about how the encampment policy and limitations on movement affect the potential of refugee businesses to scale. And then the last one is registration and documentation process, because at the end of the day, for these businesses to be able to work with other private sector businesses or to be able to engage with them, they need to sign contracts, they need to get into all of these agreements. But if the business itself is not a formal business, then it becomes very, very difficult to engage with and interact with and get into partnerships with formal businesses. So I think those three are the main barriers that affects the integration of MSMEs into the larger businesses within the country.
I'll add just one more thing on top of what Sheba said. A lot of what we're talking about is really interconnected. Luba mentioned there's this saturation of a few professions. There's 20 hairdressers. And that came out in our interviews. One of our interviewees from the Kakuma, Kalobeyei area mentioned there's a lack of variety of the products offered in the camp, and that's because of movement restrictions. If you don't already have a business, you're probably not going to get a movement pass to go out for a business reason. So refugees are limited in the new ideas and the new products that they can bring into the camps. At the same time, people from these communities know what their communities need and can be inventive in how to get it if they have the means to do so. So like, for example, one of our interviewees from the Kalobeyei area is an internet provider. He works with Safaricom to sell internet packages at local market rates, at hourly, daily, weekly, and sometimes monthly rates. And that was really unique. That was the first time we had heard of that among our refugee interviewees. And he managed to get the means to go to Nairobi. He had an ID that he could register with, and that allowed him to be innovative and do something different other than kind of these more saturated professions. So that's just something else I wanted to bring up, because I think a lot of these things are interconnected. I want to make sure we're not addressing them in isolation. And then to address this question about engaging the diaspora as a private sector, I think that's a great question. And I have an answer on two fronts. Our scope of work didn't necessarily address the diaspora, but we think it's really important and deserves further research. But then on the other hand, over 400 businesses on the continent have annual sales of over $1 billion. And we see that a lot of local businesses, that's businesses in Kenya, are not yet engaging, but want to. And we think that the scope for engagement there is really high, and the potential for homegrown and locally based engagement is also high. So just want to highlight that, and I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much. We only have a couple of minutes left, and we'd like to keep it to 4:30 East Africa time. I'd like to invite any comments or questions from any of our panelists, Botho, Luba, Reza, and Elizabeth. Any last comments, but no pressure. And if not, then I'll just conclude by saying that thank you very much, first of all, for your participation in this discussion. Obviously, as mentioned, some of these findings and recommendations are not a surprise, but I think this is a continuing conversation over the next few years, maybe. And I would like to thank Botho for the presentation of the study and financial inclusion of MS. The one aspect that we didn't get to was access to finance for entrepreneurship, but I think there's plenty on that too. We will be publishing the final version of the report in the next month or so on our website, so we'll be sure to share that with you. For the next few months or a couple of months, we will be pausing on the Research and Evidence Facilities webinar series, but we will pick back up in September. So thank you again to Luba, Shara, Elizabeth, Mukami, Reza, Fazel for joining us at this conversation, and to Botho Emerging Markets Group for your for the presentation. Sorry, I see a hand or comment. Oh, yes. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Reza. And yeah, we'll be in touch, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. And as I mentioned, the report will be available on our website. So thanks again, everybody. And thank you to everybody who participated in the conversation and questions and comments. So much appreciated. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you find yourself. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Padmini. Thanks a lot to all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Here.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.